So this is a webinar that is organized by the School of Education, Global and International Engagement jointly with the Adult Education Series. I'm Farida Pawan, professor in LDAE, as well as I lead the Global and International Engagement Unit. Our guest today is Professor Chad Hoggan. The recording has started, yes? Professor Hoggan, we're so glad to have you here. And his webinar is focused on transformative learning theory, one of the most influential theory in adult education. And he will be deliberating and sharing his work on the theory as well as in advancing it in the US as well as in Europe and globally. Dr. Hoggan is professor of adult and lifelong education at North Carolina State University. He's the co-editor of the Good Society, a journal of civic studies, and co-editor of the Institute of Civic Studies and Learning for Democracy. He served as an editor of the Journal of Transformative Education for 10 years. Along with me, this webinar will be co-moderated by graduate students in adult education, namely Katie Martinez, Jennifer Siggles, and Jake Frankel. The webinar will take the form of 30 minutes of conversation with our guest speaker. We will then proceed with about 20 to 30 minutes of questions and answers. But audience members, please post your questions whenever, and at 30 minutes, we'll draw them from the Q&A panel and we'll share them with Dr. Professor Hoggan. One of the questions to be deliberated upon today in this webinar is what it means for people when people change in significant ways. Dr. Hoggan will delve into the theory of transformative learning to describe this phenomenon of dramatic change. Professor Hoggan, I hope we can use your first name. At this point, please take it away. You're muted, Professor Hoggan.
As if I've never done this before. So yeah, appreciate that. Let me get my slideshow. Can everybody see my slideshow? Wonderful. Yeah, I think the plan today is just to give a brief overview of what transformative learning theory is and maybe kind of the directions that the literature around the theory has taken over the last really half century. I would probably frame it as saying that, humans seem to have been interested in the possibilities and potentials of human transformation since at least recorded history. Like, this is not a new thing. This has been, whether religious texts or old epics or whatever. People recognize, I believe, that we humans have the potential for deep, deep change. In 1978, with the publication of a couple of an article and a white paper, what Jack Mezirow did was said, let's look at human transformation as a learning process. What does it mean to learn in ways that's transformative? If somebody transforms, what kind of learning processes did they go through? And he initially called it perspective transformation, which is kind of a very specific theory that he had about it. But he called it transformation theory. And over time now, we tend to just say transformative learning. I would say in the literature, what differentiates Jack's work from so many others that have contributed to this theory is Jack went to the trouble to say, here are my anthropological assumptions. And by that, I mean, what does it mean to be human in ways that are relevant to his theory? And what he spent a lot of effort on is explaining that we have most of learning that we go through is relatively surface level in the sense that our fundamental frameworks for understanding the world, for understanding ourselves, aren't really called into question. We're able just to learn stuff and, within the frameworks that we have. But that we have all these behind the scenes things going on. And all those behind the scenes things, which he called habits of mind, um, form the lens through which we see the world. So every time we have experiences, we are making meaning of, we're making sense of those sights, sounds, whatever, through this certain kind of lens. And so he said, if we can, one of the tasks of adult education is to take a look at that lens. What is the lens I'm using to see the world? And certainly I'm saying that in a relatively simplistic way, but that's really the one of the most important parts of his theory is this notion of what does it mean? What's going on behind the scenes? Um, I'm going to go back one. Somewhat unfortunately, he framed that using the term habits of mind, which kind of makes it very kind of cognitively oriented, right? Because there are things behind the scenes. For instance, the way that I feel on a moment-to-moment basis, right? Whether that's elated or depressed or optimistic or pessimistic or whatever. Um, Jack Mezirow would say, yeah, that's a habit of mind, but there might be other ways of looking at stuff like that that is maybe more accurately portrayed. So, in fairness, the way he set up his anthropological assumptions takes a very cognitive view and say this is all mental functions here. Um, I would say very pivotal in Mezirow's theory is what is the driver of change? And for Mezirow, he would say, well, you have these mental frameworks, and inevitably they're all flawed, right? None of us are omniscient. As we go through life, and we become aware we become aware that some of these fundamental, he might say, assumptions about the world are flawed because it doesn't resonate with the experiences we're having. And if that builds to a critical mass, then it's disorienting, and then we become aware of maybe some assumption we have about the world. So for him, the two key drivers of change is one, critical dialogue. He said when we have conversations with other people, especially those with whom we disagree, and especially if we have the kind of conversation where we are trying to help each other understand what are some of our blind spots, this kind of critical dialogue. It's not really a debate. It's very empathetic. It's with a lot of perspective taking. It's trying to name assumptions that the other person's making. They're trying to help us see our assumptions. This for him was a huge driver of change. Um, as meaning-making creatures, we are socially meaning-making creatures. Yeah, and the second one is critical self-reflection. So we'd say, when we become aware of these assumptions we have about the world, now as adults, we, in theory, have the ability to analyze it and say, huh, I was assuming this. Do I still think that's true? Is there a better way of doing it? And for him, this is important. This is, he said adults have the responsibility to do this. If we want to live, especially, he would say, if we want to live in a free democratic society, then we need to take responsibility for the way we make sense of the world. So this critical dialogue, critical self-reflection was for Mezirow pivotal. These were the drivers of change. And the ultimate goal of all of this is to think better, to have better, more accurate, and he would always qualify that perspectives. Maybe they're just more effective. Our experiences tend to turn out better through that lens than otherwise. Very specifically, he would say our perspectives are more inclusive, discerning, permeable, and integrative of experience. So inclusive meaning it's kind of inclusive of a greater variety of experiences, right? We don't have to live in an echo chamber in order to receive validation for the way we see things. More discerning, meaning that we actually make the effort to decide, is this worth believing or not? I believe this now, and I can tell you why I believe this. It's not just something that I take for granted. Permeable, meaning when we especially have a big transformation and something that went from being behind the scenes becomes in front of the scenes and we can make a decision on it, we don't hold it quite as tightly as we did before. They're able to change more fluidly in the future. And integrative of experience that, again, that we can measure our views against experiences in the world and they hold up better. I don't want to go through his 10 phases, but one thing I would point out is when he developed this based on his research study that with women in return to work programs in the 1970s, you'll see and hear that there's a lot of lived experiences going on, learning, acquiring knowledge and skills, not necessarily transformative things, just learning stuff, taking on new social roles, and just making mistakes and being uncomfortable and going through that liminal zone, just, living through it. So I find it interesting that his 10 phase model kind of captures a lot of different types of experiences, different than just his critical dialogue and critical self-reflection. Um, but in his writings, he didn't focus on it. He focused just on kind of those things, which leads to the main critiques you get of Mezirow, and that is it tends to be cognitively focused. It tends to be individually focused. I disagree with the individual. He was a sociologist. I think he saw everything through a social lens. Um, he talks about how our perspectives are socially formed and that it's only in engagement with others, especially others with whom we disagree, that we can actually improve our thinking. It wasn't very individualistic at all, but that critique seems to have stuck. For me, the bigger question is, what was he trying to accomplish with this? Was he saying that this theory of perspective transformation is the only possibility for transformation? Like, should this answer and explain every potential type of transformation out there? And I think he would say no. Um, I think Mezirow would say this is one way that transformation could happen. This is very important because it's about adult cognitive development and taking responsibility for one's thinking. This is the kind of thing that higher education should be promoting: critical dialogue, critical self-reflection, things like that. So I think what he was doing is saying, here is a form of learning that's really important and has some transformative possibilities to it. But of course, what people want to do, and I've done this too, is you take his theory and you say, well, how does this theory work in trying to explain this other type of transformation? And, does it work? In what ways does it work or not work? And the answer is it doesn't work for all of them. That it just, it doesn't, in my opinion. So one thing that I respect about Mezirow is he didn't try to convince the world that he was correct. He said, here's a theory I have, and if you disagree, please, let's have a conversation. And I think it was 1998. So he published first in 78, and it wasn't, in the 80s, people started kind of talking about this. It picked up again in the 90s. In 98, they had the first Transformative Learning Conference, and he very specifically was reaching out to people saying, come to this conference I'm putting together and let's talk about our differences. Tell me how you see the world. Tell me how you see transformation, how it's different than how I do it. And then he published in 2000 an edited book with a compilation of people who were at that conference. And then that created a trend in the TL literature where people might write about Mezirow's work and they might do research seeing if his theory pans out, but then they would contribute other approaches is the word that people tended to use, other approaches to transformative learning. So very famously, the literature, John Dirks kind of took a Jungian lens, following Boyd and Myers, and saying, what does it look like from a kind of a psycho-developmental lens? You had people say, what does it look like from a cognitive development lens, and other kind of models besides what Mezirow was saying. Libby Tisdale said, let's look at spirituality and what does a spiritual conversion look like. And so what we have is the same name used for everything, right? Transformative learning can mean Mezirow's theory with his anthropological assumptions, with his 10 phases, with his key drivers of change, all that kind of stuff, or it can refer to any of a wide range of models or approaches or concepts or theories about human transformation. So that's what prompted me back in 2016 when I published and said, we just need to be more clear about our terms. If you want to say Mezirow's theory, then let's just say perspective transformation. That's what he called it. And now we know exactly what we mean. We mean his theory. And if we're going to say transformative learning, then it makes more sense to say, I don't know why that keeps doing that. It makes more sense to say, here is the broader umbrella of just scholarship on human transformation, especially through the lens of it being a learning process. And when you do that, then there can be some advantages to it, because you can study any of specific theory under that umbrella, or you can look at what are commonalities across these different things. So one thing I did, for instance, was I said, um, I'll go forward one, I'll come back in a second. If we look at all these different approaches to transformative learning and look specifically at when people say someone's transformed, how are they different? And instead of using the idiosyncratic vocabulary that all these different lenses have, all these different disciplinary approaches have, then we can create kind of a common vocabulary and we can speak the same language about how people might change. So, yeah, so I created a typology of outcomes saying that if you want to talk about, analyze how somebody is different after some kind of experience, then at least consider things such as how did their sense of self change, their identity, etc. How did their worldview change, like what Mesro usually talked about? But how did their epistemology change? Do they are they more critical in thinking and accepting information? I mean, what's the relationship with knowledge like? Or ontological, like I said earlier about my felt experience in the world. Is that different? And then, of course, how's their behavior changed and capacity? How has their ability to do new things that before they couldn't do? How has that changed? That's just one example of when we take TL as a meta theory and we can say, let's look at what's common among the many different approaches and models of transformation. And then I said, yeah, if we need to put fences around this and say what's transformative learning as opposed to what's not transformative learning, then the first thing I would say is life is messy. There is no clean, this is transformation, that's not transformation. You're never going to get that. And if you try to do it, you're just forcing it. But if we want to talk about the extent to which something is transformative, then we could talk in terms of depth, breadth, and stability, or let's say permanence. So how big was the change? How deep was the change? Depth. Um, did this affect one context of my life, or did this affect every context of my life? Right? And then is this a short-term change or a long-term change? And again, this kind of working with it as a meta theory is just trying to give tools so that no matter what specific theory you use, no matter what approach you use, we can come together and talk and understand each other. I'd like to point to some really good work that's out there too. For sake of time, I'm just going to choose one. Tanya Ensign's dissertation, and then she's published on it since, did something very similar to what I did. She looked at just a broad range of research studies on transformative learning and talked about like when people um, write about what begins transformation, what Mesereau called the disorienting dilemma, she said, well, it's not always a disorienting dilemma. What are some different things that might affect other ways we can analyze some transformative process? And she came up with, is this acute or is this a long-term thing? Was somebody alone in changing, or did they change towards a group? Did they change with other people? Et cetera, et cetera. Like these things really affect the experience. And so if we want to, again, analyze some instance of transformation, then these would be very useful things to consider, much like my typology. So what we have in the literature now is Mesereau's theory is still prominent, again, because it's by far the most fleshed out theory, where he provides a lot of assumptions. You can really ground your research in his anthropological assumptions. And then you have a lot of other approaches, which are less articulated. There's less to them, but they offer really, really important insights. And then at that point, you have people looking at different aspects of the transformation experience. So liminality is a common theme and one that I find really interesting. So what is the liminality experience in transformation? The sense of being not really how I was, but not really being knowing where I'm at now, just that awkward in between phase. What you have is a large area of people grabbing every lens they can think about, every model or theory out there, and saying, what would this theory say to inform our understanding of human transformation? And to wrap up my monologue, let me just say that the current Transformative Learning Conference will be held at NC State. That's why I know so much about it. It's at my university. October 21st through 23rd of this year. And for those of you who cannot make it, we're having an online conference a couple weeks later. So with that, I would love just to answer questions and discuss.
Mm. Thank you, Chad. You've given us a lot to think about. One of the things that we would appreciate is that if you would share those slides with us, and so we can also share it with our audience and also about the conference. And so at this point in time, it's we have many questions from members of the audience as well as from our moderators here. And so the co-moderators are going to take one question at a time. And everybody else, if you want to ask questions who are here in attendance, I see quite a few names here. Please post your questions at the Q&A. We'll draw them one by one. So Katie, if you want to start.
Yes, and we want to thank you for your time, Professor Hoggan. And I chose to be a part of your discussion because this is a theory that I really can see being implemented in the medical field. So thank you for that. And to start, I want to say my first question, and that is, since your work focuses on the intersection of reflection and real world interactions, I'm curious about the suggestion to add context to this theory. Do you feel context challenges or supports your research regarding how much control a learner actually has over their sociocultural constraints? Is transformation something we do to our environment, or is it something our environment does to us? So, in other words, is context such as the outside world something we act upon or something that dictates our learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that actually is central to one of the big critiques of Mesereau, Cunningham's critique of him, saying, um, and Ian Baptiste leveled this against Mesereau as well, saying, you can't really expect that you can just help people change and then the world will magically become a better place, right? Um, I think my first publication on transformative learning was emphasizing context. I think absolutely it would serve us to always make sure that there's a very explicit attention to the context. What's what's the social situation? What's my positionality within that situation? What are the norms? Things like that. So absolutely, I think any theorizing around TL should address that. Any research around TL should address that. The one thing I would say about is transformation something we do to our environment or something the environment does to us? Yeah, kind of both. I'm a big fan of Roberto Unger, and his mantra is everything is contextual, but all context can be broken. Said another way, um, everything social, if we're talking about social context, um, everything social is human made, and anything human made can be human remade. So Mesereau's point, and I absolutely agree with Mesereau on this, certainly our society shapes us, the institutions with which we live shape us and constrain us, but we have agency. We can act against it. We can rebel. There's very few times when there's a system so strong that nobody's rebelling against it. So it's not like we can't interact with it. And it was made. Now, maybe somebody didn't sit down and draw it out and make it explicitly, but it evolved through human interaction, human behavior, human action. And if it was made, it can be made differently.
Mhm.
So I would say it's absolutely both.
Well, I'm glad to hear that social perspective because a huge number of readings we've had, criticizes Mesereau just for that. And so, but I think a lot before Jennifer takes on the next questioner, is that there's a question from the audience that I think is related to what you just said, which is how do you differentiate between epistemology and ontology?
Yeah, this is me using words probably inappropriately, grabbing from philosophy. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. So what can be known and how do we know? In my writings, I use it in terms of in my moment to moment living. Um, how do I decide what I'm going to believe, what I'm not going to believe? What's the criteria that I use? What are the processes that I use? what for me is knowable, what for me is unknowable. So those kind of things that's what I say is a person's epistemology. One of the biggest, most important things in any kind of higher education program, especially training for a certain profession, is you have to teach people how to think a certain way. How do you think like an attorney? How do you think like a healthcare provider? How do we make decisions here? What do I use to justify why I believe something or why I make a certain decision? That's all epistemology. Ontology, I use that very creatively, probably inappropriately, but I use ontology as a study of being. Um, and so I think of it in terms of my being in the world. So one of the easiest ways for me to explain that is my affective, emotional experience of living on a moment-to-moment basis.
Mhm. Thank you. Jennifer?
Hi, again. Thank you so much for dedicating your time to this webinar. We really do appreciate it and the knowledge that you're sharing with us. My question is, Mazzero describes transformative learning as the process by which we transform problematic frames of reference to make them more inclusive. If someone challenges their assumptions and arrives at a conclusion that's more exclusive, is that still considered transformative learning?
I love this question. I love that. That's fantastic. Um, it depends. It depends who you ask. It depends what you mean by the term. There are a lot of people that would say transformation might be a human changing in dramatic ways, but transformative learning implies that change is somehow for the better. I disagree. So I think that's a very valid view. And if somebody wants to take that, I can appreciate that. I would say humans can transform in so many different ways. People can become wise with age. They can become more empathetic. They can become more soft. They become more understanding of the world, a more complex relationship with the world. Or they become more black and white. They can become hardened. They can choose to become more simplistic in their view of the world. If they change in a big way, I would call that transformation. And I would say whatever learning processes they went through to arrive there is transformative learning, right? So I've done some work around radicalization and what does it look like when somebody uh, adopts a very black and white view of the world. For me, that's a very ugly kind of transformation. It's really bad for the world. But there's still a learning process. What was that learning process? What was that like? So if you
Mhm.
ask, so uh, for Mesereau, he would say probably that's not transformative learning. That's not the outcome of perspective transformation the way he talked about it. True enough. For me, I would say, yeah, anything is transformation can be anything, and whatever learning is there is there. So let's just study it and let's name it and describe the differences with it.
Mhm. I'm glad you mentioned that because we also ran into the dark side of transformation and we wanted to raise that, dark side of funds of knowledge, dark side of, TL as
Uh,
well. Jake?
Yeah, and again, Professor, thanks so much for doing this. I'm gonna kind of, I think, simplify my question. So, because I think it's sort of based on what you've already said, but essentially, my question is on Mesereau has a description of the transformation process being best accomplished by, and then the quote is engaging in critical discourse or dialogue with others, where the purpose is to seek understanding in each other's views. We did something. We had a transformational like leadership program at my last job. My question is more, how's that role of transformation, even if it's smaller, like you kind of just mentioned, how do we bring that into like vocational training? Like if I'm learning to become a welder, where does my transformation happen?
so yeah, very, very importantly for me is I'm not sure educators should be out there trying to transform people. Um, it depends. So, one article that I would recommend is by me and Tetiana Hogan-Klubert. We're called The Ethics of Transformative and Radical Education. And just to frame my answer, we say, there are three ways of maybe approaching this. So one would be, as the educator, I'm trying to transform somebody. And I'm like, well, oof, do you mean transformation like it affects all areas of their life? It affects their relationships. It might cause them to get a divorce. Is that what you're trying to do? Like, what right do you have to do that? Now, I think you do have the right and the obligation to say, if you want to be a healthcare provider, you need to think a certain way. And you might need to have certain norms of behavior. And there's certain things like that. And if that for somebody causes a transformation, then I don't know that I'm trying to transform them, but yeah, I need them to understand what is expected in this profession. But a second way of approaching it, instead of saying I'm trying to transform somebody, you could say there are processes that contribute to learning, and nothing always leads to transformation. Nothing guarantees transformation, but there are certain processes that if you follow, I have to admit, I do think over time could have a transformative effect. So critical thinking, right? If you learn how to engage in critical thinking, then over time, if you learn to use it habitually, you will be much different than you are now. Same thing with creative thinking, same thing with empathy, same thing with a lot of that. So there's this kind of outcome-oriented transformative approach that I would disagree with. I would think it's in most cases, inappropriate. A process-oriented, which I think is totally appropriate. And then I think as an educator, a good educator, you should be aware of what is it about this program that causes a lot of kind of transformative learning challenges for my students, for all of them, for some of them. And then it behooves me to try to provide some kind of supports for those students. Yeah. So yeah, I wouldn't say for vocational training, how do I make this transformative? I don't just do what Newman said. Just do good training, man. There's some good stuff out there. Not everything has to be transformative, but recognize that there's also the possibility of these kind of transformative learning challenges that if you address, you can really help your students.
This relates to our discussion about behaviorism, the cause and effect. We're not in that business at this point in time. And so, in terms of, I think Jennifer raised an important point that she wants you to follow up. And so we'll start with Jennifer's point here. Jennifer, and then we'll go back to Katie. Yeah, Jen?
Yeah. So the follow-up question I have to that is from one of our classmates where she says that one of our required reading for class was Nordstrom 2021, Adult Educators Making a Difference, Transforming Lives. It focuses on transformative learning where adults critically reflect on their experiences and beliefs, resulting in meaningful personal growth and change. Have you experienced or observed an adult educator making a significant impact?
I heard to me, the question's slightly different than the lead up. Have I seen adult educators transform, or have I seen adult educators really have a kind of a transformative impact on people?
Have you seen adult educators have that transformative impact on their learners?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I can tell you one example that I find so inspiring was a program called Training Futures in Washington, D.C. This is a program targeting people in poverty that were migrants, and most all of whom did not speak English as a first language. And they wanted to train them to be kind of office workers, office administrators in medical offices. And they knew going into it, like this is going to be it's not just about learning how to type. And they had to teach them how to type, right? It is these things, but the harder learning challenges are all around them, what I would call the transformative learning challenges. And they designed the whole program around that. Let me give you like one example, just for instance. So they said the local community college offered to give them classroom space. And they said, we don't want your classroom space because that learning in a classroom environment is not going to translate into them being able to do this job in a medical office. So they rented space in an industrial park and they created a medical office looking environment. And so the students learned literally the way they would learn if they were working. And then they took them to a local equivalent to a Goodwill, and they had kind of a fashion coach with them saying, this is what office dress would need to look like. This is how you look through it. and they got some funding, and they bought them several outfits. They had to wear the outfits to work. And so they basically said, when you show up, this is how you need to be.
Mhm.
And that program had 97% success rate in terms of graduation, finishing the program, and tremendous success in these people actually getting jobs in those fields, because they were looking at more of the holistic things about how do you change the habitus, your way of interacting, your mannerisms, even the way, again, but the way you think, the way you
Mhm.
dress, all these kinds of things. Now, did that transform the people? I don't know. It depends on how you want to define transformation. But it
Mhm.
converted the people so that they were able to live in a very, very different social environment, taking on a very, very different social role, and feel more comfortable and be able to function there. So anyway, I think people that really good educators that take seriously, like, what is it we're trying to accomplish holistically? I always see elements of them supporting transformative learning in that kind of education.
That's amazing. That was a Sarah question. I should acknowledge that. Katie, you want to ask another? And there are other questions coming in from the audience, but I think Katie is waiting in the wings. Go ahead, Katie.
Here, I would like to share a question from our classmate Melita. She says, as a teacher, educator working with pre-service early childhood teachers, I'm interested in how transformative learning theory applies to young children. In your work, drawing on Mezirow, childhood is framed as primarily formative, while adulthood is transformative. Given this distinction, how do you conceptualize the possibility of transformative learning in early childhood? Do you see it as developmentally constrained, particularly in relation to depth, breadth, and relative stability, especially depth, as shifts in underlying frames of reference? Or might transformation take different forms in early childhood? And if so, how should we recognize or conceptualize it?
Yeah. Oof, nice question. Um, so first off, I would say transform, children change in dramatic ways all the time. It- so, much more frequently than adults do. So when I say, does transformative learning apply to children? Yeah, sure. It certainly does in the sense that children are changing in dramatic ways. One of the points that Mezirow was made, I think it's a valid point, is that the reason we say it's formative is because as kids, we're just soaking this in, right? We're adapting to our environment as humans. We learn through social osmosis so much. So kids are going through that. They're immersed in a social environment, and they haven't really, speaking of developmentally, they haven't developed yet kind of the metacognitive skills. So they're not taking all this stuff critically as much as they're just absorbing it, right? From Mezirow, that ability is central to everything. Either you can determine what you're going to believe, or you just adapt to whatever's there. And for him, determining what you're going to believe made the difference between the formation in childhood and transformation that's possible in adulthood. If you're going to take it kind of more the Hoggan approach, where all transformation is transformation, whatever, um, yeah, I would say it's different too. Another thing going on with the kids is they are experiencing cognitive development very rapidly in ways that, we can develop in adulthood as well, but it's a much different process. Kids, it's very, relatively speaking, very rapidly happening. Um, and so as they develop the capacity to think with more complexity, to differentiate more, and they're developing this, then of course they're changing their dramatic ways in the way that they relate to the world, the way they see the world, and stuff like that. So I think transformation, yeah, absolutely happens all the time. I think if I were concerned about that as an educator, I probably would look at the literature and the research around child development before I would the research and scholarship around adult transformative learning, because they're just kind of working with different things.
Mhm. So I think there are a few questions from the audience, but I think the questions probably pertain more toward the end of the conversation because they're more summative questions. So I'm just going to jump into Jake and his questions. Jake?
Yeah, I have a question from Jeremy, our classmate Jeremy. He says, transformation is often predicated on learners engaging in situations that challenge their perceptions, including their self-perceptions. In your view, what does that make all situations that challenge our perceptions worth engaging in for learning and growth? When a learner is in an environment that painfully challenges their view of themselves or the world, is leaving that environment a failure to, and then in quotes, transform?
That's a really astute question because when we deal with any, when we use the word, I'm going to insert the word should, right? Should a person engage with challenging experiences that might transform? Immediately, I think, well, from whose perspective should I? Um, from the perspective of the learner, um, it's much more frequent that I am in a challenging situation, and at some point I back away and I maintain my current ways of thinking and being in the world. It's difficult to change, especially that deep, deep stuff that Mesra was talking about. This is not an easy thing. It's not something I could just choose to do anyway. Usually there needs to be some kind of impetus, some kind of, whether it's pain or need or something to drive me to really kind of become aware of things that are just common sense, that are just so behind the scenes, right? So I wouldn't frame somebody stepping away from something as a failure to transform. Sometimes we don't have the capacity at that moment to engage in something. I can think of a number. And if let's say that I've been through some big changes recently, I'm tired. I need some stability. We can punctuated equilibrium, right? I mean, I need some time before I feel maybe equipped or with the power to really engage in that kind of deep change again. Or what if it's something that could be deeply challenging, but I don't really need it? Like maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know, man. It's, if I don't have like that compelling need to draw to really engage in it. So I I think we accept cognitive dissonance, if you will. We accept the fact that our ways of thinking and being aren't quite adequate all the time because it
Mhm.
allows us to function. And it's
Mhm.
only when we really can't function or for whatever reason it builds to critical mass that we actually do make the change.
I think a follow-up to that, Jeremy is here, so I think he's listening to this intently. He also asked about the scale of change. How big a transformation, how big a change before it becomes something called transformation. If I may speak for Jeremy, who's here.
Yeah. I think the whole world, almost everything is a spectrum, right? So people change, and are they changing in small ways or big ways? And at what point does that become transformation? I'm not sure you could ever really define that. For me, it needs to be something big, to use a very technical term. It needs to be a big change that affects more than just one part of my life. Just say, for example, that I'm in a job and I'm in a new leadership position and it's been a struggle and I really change in some deep ways that change how I am as the manager of a small group at work. Somebody could say, wow, Chad's really transformed in that role. And I would say, sure, as long as you say in that role. Did that change how I am with my neighbor? Did it change how I am with my wife? Does it change how I am all the time? That's this issue of breadth. And for somebody to say somebody's changed, I would say it needs to be a big change and it needs to have some of this breadth. It needs to, or I would just say the whole person hasn't changed. It's just I changed in this one context. And I think we are contextual creatures. I think we change all the time to be slightly different in different contexts. So if you're asking me, I would say it's transformation when it's a big change and affects all areas of my life and it doesn't go away in 3 days, right? I've watched a documentary before in 3 or 4 days, it really affected me. And then I went back to however I was. It's not transformation. It's just than
That was
emotional.
an Aubrey question as well, another one of our participants here. I think before we go on, there was another point I think that needs to be addressed, which is the irreversibility. I think you mentioned that it has to be moving forward rather than reversing. Is irreversibility a must?
Yeah, it depends. So I would think if somebody changes, like I said, they have some experience, they have a near-death experience, and they just really for the next month appreciate life. Their quality of life is different for a month. Would you say they transformed? And I would say no. That's not a transformation. That's something. It's worth looking at, but that's not a transformation, right? Transformation, I think, is when it lasts a long time. But of course, somebody could change again. And I would point to Robert Keegan and others, who I think very said your way of thinking and being in the world, even when you grow past it, is always still there, right? It's not like it goes away. Sometimes you'll see in people, you might see in yourself, there's a way of being in the world, and then you kind of mature or whatever, you grow past it, but then there's some trigger, if you will. Let's say a lot of stress or whatever, and you retreat to maybe former ways of seeing the world, right? So it's not like we ever lose them. We always have them. We've just kind of grown past them. So for transformation, I would just say, yeah, we grew past them. We changed in some ways, and they're stable. That's why I say relative stability. Um, at the end of the day, I think anything's reversible. Um, I've personally seen somebody go into cognitive decline and become a younger version of themselves. They became their 12-year-old self.
Mhm.
And my way of making sense of that was, yeah, they had some brain damage, and but they still had that way of being in the world. It was always there, right?
You told us many stories. I think that's one of the questions from one of our attendees as well, in terms of specific stories of people. So I thank you for that question from the audience and your response. Katie, you had another question to draw from? Mute.
I am muted. Let's see. Okay, my second question goes towards my background. So I'm an educator in a radiography medical training program, and students, they often experience a disorienting dilemma when transitioning from the lab to the clinical site. So even though they have the technical skills that they need to perform the job, they often struggle with that social integration that is required to navigate in the clinical environment. Our program, we already have many critical thinking assignments and critical reflection assignments that allow this soul work in the classroom. But how can we practically shift our focus to support students as they navigate this high pressure reality of patient care and that social integration aspect into the hospital team, rather than just focusing on their internal reflections?
Yeah, fair. The irony is when you talk about critical reflection, you're talking that's very Meserowian language, right? And you're like, but there's a transformative experience where we're already doing that, and it's not doing this. That's kind of what I mean by Mesero's theory is helpful, but it doesn't apply everywhere. Um, yeah, so I think what you're referring to is more of somebody embodying a certain like a way of thinking and a way of being in practice, right? So you talk about social integration, but also um, yeah, those kinds of things. I would say this is what I mean about adaptive approaches to implementing transformative learning is the educator recognizing that it's not just about the content. It's not just about certain skills. There's something beyond it. So there's nothing wrong with teaching those. They're great. But what's beyond it, and do I need to support that? And sometimes you're going to be wrestling people with, let's say, imposter syndrome. Like they don't really see themselves in that role. They're having a hard time kind of accepting that identity that holds them back. Anything like that. I would say one of the most helpful things is acknowledging that difficulty and helping people understand that this isn't them. It's not just a weakness of theirs. It's not that they're weird, they're incapable. This is common. This is a common learning curve that's beyond the mental part of this
Mhm.
training program. Um, So you can have resources available to them. You can have peer mentoring. You can have a mentor assigned to them. You can have former people who've been through the program come and just speak to the group and talk about how they went through that. And those kind of things, they're not difficult to do. And those can be really powerful to help people, one, engage with that as a learning process instead of just saying, I've got the critical thinking, I'm doing this and this, and just kind of resisting that because it's not what they're used to in terms of a learning program.
Mm-hmm. Translating that into the workplace, I think this is also one of Kylie's questions. So I'm making that connection. One of the things I think that was not asked yet is a question from Jody, which is the idea of liminality. And so she is interested in what happens because one of your writings is about refugee resettling and finding transitions, finding themselves. So Jody's asking about international students that she teaches, feeling the exact same way, this transitional feeling that does not go away, right? And so what are your thoughts on that in terms of transformation? Is transformation happening, or is it there's no endpoint to that, really?
Yeah, I'm being a migrant myself. Um, so, there's somebody out there, Somanita Kiang, Kheang. She was actually my
Mm-hmm.
managing editor of the journal for a long time. She writes about that very explicitly. Whenever you grow up in one environment and you are moved into another environment, so obviously there's a transition that takes place. And part of when we talk about liminality, it's that feeling of I'm no longer who I was. At the same time, I don't really know where I'm at now, right? So I think that's very much a thing in transformation. There probably is some overlap with the migrant experience. Where it might be different is in liminality in a transformative experience, I think that normally that does go away. At some point, you get used to your new normal. For migrants, a lot of times even when you go home, it doesn't feel like home anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not what you remember. You're different than what is. And where you're at now is kind of home, but it never feels like home. And and it's actually kind of a painful experience. Like, I don't know if I have a home. My home is wherever I'm at. My home is wherever my loved ones are at. But in terms of that sense where you just took the world for granted because it's all you ever knew, that's gone. And it doesn't ever really come back. And I wouldn't call that liminality. We use the term torn between two worlds. You're living in that in-between space. And so, yeah, sure, it's liminal in that way.
Transformation? Is it transformation?
I think that feeling in and of itself is not necessarily transformation. I think that experience can certainly be a disorienting dilemma, which could lead to transformation.
Mm-hmm. That's a good response because I'm living it
Yeah.
myself. And so at this point in time, I think we've asked all the questions that we have listed, right? My co-moderators, unless you have a question, I'm going to draw from the audience here. I think in the next few minutes that we have, what motivated you to study transformative learning? Have you investigated it in full, or are there still some nuances and layers which you have yet to explore? Chad?
Yeah. So when I don't want to go into the details, but I will say when I was 32, I had a major transformative experience that in some ways was very um, epochal. Like I would say over a 3-week period, I changed in some big ways. And in other ways, it just started a very long process where I changed quite a bit over the next decade. Um, when I was a year into that is when I started my graduate program, and we studied as a very small part of my introductory course, we studied transformative learning theory. And for me, it was like a thunderclap. It was here's somebody putting words to things I've experienced. And so a lot of there's no doubt in my mind that when I think through transformative learning, when I evaluate what I read and say, do I believe that? Does it resonate with me or not? I'm almost always comparing it to that and probably one more big transformative experiences that I had. I would also say that growing up, I moved every year and a half, and I always felt like a chameleon. Like I felt how context shapes us. And I was always intrigued with that too, with our potential to change, in change in ways that are temporary and contextual, and then change in ways that move beyond the context. No matter what context I'm different now than I was before. I certainly have not. I do not understand transformation. I would say I've scratched the surface. Um, I've been writing a book on my theory of transformation learning for probably 5 years now because I'm like, I don't know. It's it's fascinating, and there's so many different facets to it. Um, yeah, and the problem with theorizing is whenever you write a theory, you are simplifying something that's way too complex, just so people can get some kind of grasp of it. But once you do it, you avoid a lot of the complexity, a lot of the realness that's there.
Well, you've written 7 books on transformational theory, so well, so I'm sure you've delved with many, many layers, which we don't have time for to discuss. Is there something at this point in time that we've not asked you that you would like to bring up, that you'd like to for us to think about as we leave this webinar?
Yeah, it was really nice. My last few years as editor of the Journal of Transformative Education, whenever I wrote an editorial, I felt like I had the freedom just to say whatever I wanted to say to the field. And one of my last pieces was called "The Seven Cardinal Sins of Transformative Learning Scholarship." I th I want the scholarship to move forward. I want us to have a better and better understanding. And I think in some ways we're caught in a rut. Um, and so I would encourage people to instead of just repeating what other people have said about critiques of Mesereau or about a certain approach, um, I think what the scholarship really needs are people that just think about their experiences, things they've seen, and say, what do I think about transformative learning? That that the scholars out there now aren't talking about because academic fashion is absolutely a thing. And yeah, I would encourage some of that.
That's a good invitation for us, who are hoping one day that we can also publish in the esteemed journals that you've co-edited and that you've led. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Chad. You've made us think differently, and you've raised more questions, as always, for us to think about as we leave. So thank you again for taking us to a different place in terms of thinking about transformational learning. Thank you, everyone, and
Very
good
well.
night. Goodbye.